Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this 30-minute webinar on Finding Focus. My name is Roger Fiedler, and I'm the Communications Director here at McREL. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to our presenter today, Brian Goodwin, but first, just a couple of housekeeping items. Our session is scheduled to go for about 30 minutes with some time for question and answer at the end with Brian. You can ask a question at any time during the webinar by typing it into the chat window in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll be collecting and combining your questions along the way, and Brian will save some time at the end to address them. For those of you who are joining us today who might not be familiar with McREL, we are a profit, nonpartisan research and development organization that studies best practices in teaching, leading, and learning, and then we turn that knowledge into guidance and training for teachers, principals, and education leaders. And now on to today's session. Our presenter today is McREL's CEO, Brian Goodwin. Brian is a former educator and journalist who has been with McREL since 1998. He is the author or co-author of several of McREL's books, including Balanced Leadership for Powerful Learning, Simply Better, and the 12 Touchstones of Good Teaching. And with that, I'll turn today's session over to Brian.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, everyone who's on the call this morning. And I think there'll be a lot of folks listening later too. So welcome to everyone. As Roger mentioned, we are a nonprofit research and development organization. Really, what we see though as the contribution we try to bring to educators like you all is helping sift through a lot of information and provide some clarity with a few big things to focus on. So really, that's the gist of our presentation today. Now, many of us, I think all of us, when we get into education, it's pretty simple reasons why we do this work. And I think for any of us who've been teachers, the moment you see that light bulb go on for a kid, that's probably when you say, I'm hooked. This is what I want to do with my life. And so it's pretty simple when we start out. It's all about student learning. But a funny thing happens, along the way, whether it's during the course of a school year between September and May, or just simply the course of a school day, right? I'm sure many of you, if you're principals, teachers, you walk in the door at whatever it might be, 7 a.m., and you have these 3 or 4 things you want to work on, and then suddenly it's 5 p.m., and you're thinking, what happened to my day? How did I spend my time? And the kind of things that you see flashing on the screen, many of them are very important, right? People can say there's a research base behind these things. These are important things to do. But what happens over time is that the thing we set out to do starts to get crowded out. We start wondering about whatever happened to student learning, and maybe asking this other more nagging question: am I focused on the right things? Am I really getting anything accomplished? As we've talked to educators from all across the country, we surveyed several hundred last summer. One of the biggest things that came up, probably the number one thing that people said is the biggest challenge for them, is initiative overload. There are so many things to focus on, whether they're state or federal mandates, or just things that people come back from conferences with, a new idea, something they want to do. And we know that trying to do several things at once is usually a recipe for doing nothing well at all. The key to doing something well is always to focus and find a few things that we're going to be effective with. And so we thought actually now maybe timely in a way for this webinar. We're halfway through the school year for most of you. We're close to that 100 days, right? And maybe you're wondering, am I getting done what I said I would be doing? Last summer when I wrote that school improvement plan, or my team came together, are we accomplishing any of those things? And how can we do a few things better? And if I were only going to focus on a handful of things, or maybe just 1 or 2 things, what would those things be? So, I think that's the biggest challenge. And sometimes you can feel like you're kind of lost in a fog, right? There's so many things to worry about. What should be my beacon or my light in the fog? As Roger mentioned, what we do, really we see our role is translating lots of information. In fact, every year there's about 40,000 new research reports and journal articles just in the field of education alone. There's no way anybody can keep up with all of that. We try to help people take all the information, connect those dots into compelling ideas, new insights. But we're not just a think tank at McREL. We're also all about practical application. And we work alongside people all over the nation, actually all over the world, helping them implement those ideas, turn those ideas into action. But what's deep inside for all of us the reason we come to work in the morning is we want to help students flourish. We want to help professionals flourish. And what we mean by that is, every kid should have their own path to success and have a chance to find their own passions for learning and to have a fulfilling life. And that's really what we're all about. So we focus on improving student achievement, but think about that in a broad way as well. So how we've come to this work, I'm going to be introducing a number of different kind of research studies we've been doing and lines of research that we've been engaged in. A few years ago, we started asking this question. When you think about, there are organizations out there that have to get it right all the time because any mistake, any failure can be catastrophic. You think about something like NASA, Space Shuttle Command, or wildland firefighting, or air traffic control, where a mistake can be catastrophic. Those organizations are able to deliver not just 99% success rate, but 5 nines of performance. An example would be, aviation in the U.S. If aviation in the U.S. had a 99% success rate, that would still mean 800 planes would be crashing every day. Of course, none of us would fly if those were our chances. So aviation has figured out how to get really high level of performance. And what these high reliability organizations do is they have unpredictable conditions. Weather is always changing, as you know, for any of those endeavors. So they know that there's unexpected conditions are going to, circumstances will arise, but they start to think about what are the routines we have to put in place to really address the complexity. How do we simplify things and say there's a few things we've got to do really well? And they focus on areas where any variability in execution is going to have big consequences for results. So they focus on creating routines in place, but they don't stop there. They're also focused on developing people's talents so that people in real time on the front lines, if you will, can be addressing the challenges that arise. And they go one step beyond that. Ultimately, what high reliability organizations do is they're always doing rapid cycle innovation, but in a shared way, not one person going off and doing something cool and not sharing it with the rest. It's always about taking those innovations and actually putting them back into the new standard operating procedures. So let's get more specific here. Think about aviation, for example. Clearly unpredictable conditions, right, that arise all the time with weather and everything else. What aviation does is they've gotten very good at some standardized routines. Every cockpit, for example, has checklists they go through. Pre-flight checklists, or if something goes wrong in midair, there's always checklists to follow. The next step is they really work on developing people's expertise. To become an airline pilot, you had to log thousands of hours of flights on smaller planes, also in flight simulators. That's the image that you're looking at there. It's a flight simulator. And then they are always improving performance. So NTSB will come out and do investigations after any disaster or near disaster and figure out how do we avoid that in the future. Those oftentimes get translated right back into checklists. So if you've seen the movie Sully, right, about Sully Sullenberger, you know that he had a pre-flight checklist. He also had a checklist to go through when the birds first hit the engines. But he had developed so much expertise over his 40 years of flying that he also understood very quickly that he had to change course and that he could technically land his airplane in the middle of the Hudson River, and that was the safest place to land. Now in the movie, the NTSB was made out to be the bad guys. That's not true if you look it up. That's just Hollywood. In reality, NTSB is always about investigating any crash to say, how do we get better next time, and how do we learn from what Sully Sullenberger did? Every pilot actually spends hours studying airline disasters and near misses, and so now, of course, their airplane landing in the Hudson will be an example going forward of what to do if you face similar circumstances. All right, so that's all nice and theoretical. All of this stuff, though, we've worked with school systems to help them improve. So these aren't just simply theoretical things. These are real-life pathways that we've seen when school systems improve. Here are the pathways they follow. So the point, one of the big ideas here is that success is always a journey. Oftentimes we find in school systems student success is left to chance, right? Some kids do well, a lot of kids drop out. So what effective systems do is they figure out what are the proper routines to put in place. And I'm going to describe several here over the next half an hour of what those routines are. they don't end there. They also think about how do we develop talent so that we have teachers that can operate with mental frames, or so if students are falling behind, teachers know, oh, here's some things I can try with these students. I'm not simply going to follow the book. I'm going to figure out how do we adapt things for particular student populations and do that in a collaborative kind of shared way. But these systems are also, they become highly effective at developing innovations in a shared way. If you read case studies on schools that have moved towards personalization effectively, they'll always say it's because we had to kind of fail forward together, but we were using data in real time and working together. So again, it wasn't a bunch of islands of excellence. It was everyone working on the same page. So what happens, though, in a lot of systems, they recognize the need that they had to have routines, and they put those routines in place. But so often we'll hear people say, you know, we used to have those data protocols or whatever it might be, and whatever happened to those? So it seems like those have kind of faded, and then inevitably we kind of end up right back where we started. That happens a lot of times. Now sometimes this happens. People recognize the need for routines, they adopt routines, things get better, and then they say, well, okay, those routines don't always work. Even the best routine is not going to work all the time for all students. So sometimes what people say is, well, okay, that curriculum wasn't exactly right. Let's throw that out. Let's start with something new. And we go back through the implementation dip all over again, and we keep plateauing because we keep adopting new routines over and over again, instead of saying, maybe now it's time to start to develop some expertise here, develop talent, so that we can start to adapt what we've adopted. I'm going to keep coming back to this idea because it's an important one. One thing we see when we look across education systems, both nationally and internationally, is there's a lot of performance plateaus. Studies, for example, of turnaround schools in Virginia found that they could improve for about 3 years, then they had a plateau. Same thing in Texas. High-stakes testing drove some initial performance gains, probably because it focused people's energies and their attention on creating better routines. But then we see in those schools performance also hit a plateau. Same thing, a study of 25 states found in all 25 states, again, high-stakes pressure, high-stakes testing pressure to improve could get those initial gains, but then followed by plateaus. It's a worldwide phenomenon, as it turns out, that systems worldwide oftentimes encounter the same performance plateau. Maybe you right now in your school are saying, yeah, we're kind of getting stuck here too. What's going to get us unstuck? So I'm hoping what you hear in the next 20 minutes or so may give you some new ideas to say, perhaps that's going to help us move forward. We've got to move beyond those routines, or we need to step back a bit and put some new routines in place so we have a foundation on which to build. So let's talk a bit about what is the stuff that we need to focus on and how do we put these routines in place. So a number of years ago, we had a foundation that came to McREL, and they were interested in redesigning school systems. They had said, you know, really the unit of change ought to be a school district, because otherwise you end up with islands of excellence, and you've got to have successful elementary schools preparing kids for success in middle school and high school and so forth. So they asked McREL to do a sweeping synthesis of research. We looked at hundreds of studies, initially drafted 8 reports, which then became a single report and a single book, Simply Better. Really that identified these 5 key leverage points. You look at those, they may not surprise you much, and they probably shouldn't. I mean, we were looking at decades of research to say, what are the most important things? Thinking about John Hattie talks about a hinge point at which we know we're truly having an effect on student achievement. Not just kind of good, but really, really powerful effects. And here are those 5 things. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking each of those 5 things so we have some more clarity about what we mean by these. So let's start with this one. No real surprise here. We know teaching is really, really important. So we talk about guaranteeing challenging, engaging, and intentional instruction. Each of these ideas, by the way, in the What Matters Most framework are leverage points. They're not just simply a factor. They're things that people do better, and the better they do them, the better results they have. So really what we're saying with this is there are 3 imperatives, 3 must-dos of teaching. Teachers have to challenge their kids, have to be demanding, but they also have to support them. They have to create that nurturing environment and those interpersonal connections with their students that are so important for learning success. But also teachers have to be intentional. They have to know why they're doing what they're doing. and start to develop those mental frames that experts develop, almost always operating through generating and testing hypotheses and saying, okay, if I try this, what's going to happen? So we might think about these three ideas as kind of a three-legged stool, right? With any three-legged stool, you take away one idea or one leg of the stool, and you're going to get less effective results. So sometimes we can imagine teachers that are like this. They set high expectations, and they nurture their students, but maybe they haven't fully formed their professional practice yet. They don't have a complete repertoire of teaching strategies or full intentionality about, I use this strategy in this circumstance to get these outcomes. And they're not going to be effective with all students. You can also picture teachers or student teachers who are like this, setting a high bar. They're very intentional with their teaching practices, but maybe they don't really see it as their responsibility to connect with students. We can picture a lot of those teachers. We probably have had a few of those. Some kids do okay in those environments, but the old adage is that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Rings very true, and there's research that shows this, that student-teacher relationships are a critical driver for student success. So we need teachers who form those connections, but sometimes we have this kind of teacher, very supportive and very intentional with their instruction, but maybe they're not setting a high bar for students, perhaps out of a misguided sense of sympathy. I don't want to make kids feel bad if they don't succeed. But the point here is that we need teachers who can have all three legs of that stool. So I might ask you to think about this a little bit. In your own school or in your own district, depending on your environment, where are your teachers? Do you have teachers do you have a lot of inconsistency in your teaching practice? Or are you getting teachers to where, no, we're doing the routines pretty well, and that's important, but maybe it's pretty rudimentary or kind of compliance-oriented. When people show up to observe classrooms, they're doing the work, but maybe not all the time. Or do you feel like, no, we're getting a lot of expertise. Maybe it's a lot of peer coaching that's happening, and people are working together to improve their teaching practice. And ultimately, I think where we all want to get to is feeling like we've got teachers who are innovative. They're working together on solving problems, coming up with new ideas and creative solutions for helping all kids succeed. So you might just pause a moment and think about, where is my school on this pathway? Because it's important. We see a lot of examples of sometimes schools will try to do in the very same improvement plan. Real life example, I've seen a school write in their improvement plan that, hey, we're going to do one-to-one laptop initiatives this year. Okay. But in that very same improvement plan, also we're going to focus on setting student objectives. So you might look at it and go, well, okay, student objectives are really important, and it's kind of rudimentary teaching strategy. Why would you leap ahead to an innovation like one-to-one initiatives, one-to-one laptop initiatives, if you're still not doing some of the basics required for teaching? So that's something you may want to ponder. Where are you in that pathway? Let's talk a moment about curriculum. Now, we frame it as ensuring curricular pathways to success. In other words, we don't need a one-size-fits-all curriculum. At some point, we want to use standards as a platform for creativity and for personalization. And here's some real-life examples of this. Karen Chenoweth, who's an author with the Education Trust, profiled a number of successful, what Education Trust calls spelling the myth schools. So schools that are high poverty, but also have high achievement. So what she found is interesting. Over and over again in these schools that she was profiling, they all seem to spend a lot of time and energy initially getting their curriculum house in order. A number of them would do it this way. They would simply adopt what we might call an off-the-shelf curriculum. You see some examples here. Pretty different curricula if you know these well. It was interesting, it almost wasn't so much which curricula they chose, but the fact they chose one and they did it well, and they did it with consistency. Another example is sometimes these schools would put together an entire binder full of lesson plans to say to teachers, here are good lesson plans. You could do worse than use these. And it doesn't mean that they were forcing every teacher to only use those lesson plans. If you can do better, but sometimes we wonder, why would we afflict a first-year teacher who's struggling with lots of things to also have to write 180 days or how many ever days in your school year of new lesson plans? Why not let them, stand on the shoulders of giants, if you will, their colleagues in the school? One of the principals in these turnaround schools said it was really what it was called the Burger King model. We got away from the Burger King have it your way model to saying to teachers, it's really having a clearly articulated curriculum is really important, because what it means is we want to make sure kids in second grade are getting what they need to be successful in third grade and so on. So we got to work together on this. We got to sing from the same sheet of music, if you will. And when teachers, I think teachers understand that, right? That we all have to be doing our jobs to make sure that kids are successful and they can flourish ultimately. Now, what's interesting though is in Karen's case studies, she found that over time, a lot of those schools would start to adapt the curriculum they've adopted. They might realize it's not exactly perfect for our group of kids or for our standards that we're trying to address. But instead of saying, okay, now you all get to go back to Burger King and have it your way, they said, but we're going to adapt the curriculum together. We're going to work on this in a consistent, collegial way. So think for a moment about, where do you see your school maybe in this progression, or your school system in this progression? Are you still having kind of a Burger King model of curricula? Or are you starting to get to where your curriculum is both guaranteed and viable? And the viability part is making sure there's not so much stuff in there that you have to blaze through it, and it's a mile wide and inch deep. Are you really spending some time saying, what are the most important essential standards to teach? How do we make sure that's really happening? Do we have pacing guides so teachers understand how much time to spend on a particular concept? Those are some of those crucial routines. And ultimately, though, like I said, any curriculum is probably not going to be right for all kids all the time. So are you moving more towards adapting those? And, ultimately, we probably want a curriculum that starts to feel more personalized for students. But it's important that people understand that we still have to be basing those on some consistent expectations for what learning looks like. So you might think about it this way. We have to learn how to work together on the same page. We have to learn how to learn together. And then we can start to innovate together. And those new innovations can start to become the new routines that we put in place. Make sense? So moving on, let's think about, even when you get the curriculum and instruction right, we know that kids have various needs. Some kids come to school with less preparation, or just simply additional needs. All kids are different. So we think about this as whole child student supports. How do we support every kid in being successful? And this pathway looks kind of like this. Some of those routines might be around school safety. We want kids to feel physically and emotionally safe. They can't learn if they're not feeling that. Or you might even back up and say maybe it's more physiological things. We want to make sure they're not coming to school hungry. That's vitally important. The next piece is really, how do we support kids? How do we catch them before they fall? And that really requires expertise, to understand when kids are falling behind and just see it. And then say, now, what are the strategies that we use? Some of those could look like routines. They might be protocols that we follow when we find kids who are struggling with reading or phonemic awareness or whatever it might be. But then eventually we want to get to maybe where it's really a culture of learning, where we think about things like having a growth mindset, or really addressing some social emotional factors that we know. There's increasing numbers of studies that are coming out showing how important it is that we help kids develop, for example, an internal locus of control. But that's really about creating school culture that starts to emphasize the importance of effort. But it probably comes after we've already taken care of some of these other things that are also vitally important. So once again, maybe ponder for a moment, where are you on this pathway that we just kind of laid out here? And you might want to be thinking, well, there's some things I need to go back and lay some foundation here before I can begin to think about mindfulness or other things that might be seen as more of an innovation or an innovative strategy. All right, so now we've talked about curriculum, we've talked about instruction, and whole child student supports. Well, all of this has to happen, of course, inside of a school environment, inside of a high-performance school culture. So I'm going to ask you for a moment to imagine this. Imagine that you've been invited to participate in a study, and it's in Louisiana, so that's a picture of Louisiana. You've been invited out to look at schools, and these schools are matched comparison schools. In other words, they're very similar in terms of socioeconomic status among the students and wealth and everything else. But there's one important difference. One school is high performing, and the other comparison school is low performing. So this is a real life study that was done. People looked around at different classrooms. They were lay observers. And they were not told, though, by the way, which school was high performing, which was low performing. And yet to a person, in this study, all of the observers were able to tell which were the high performing schools, which were the low performing schools. The researcher, a guy named Sam Stringfield, was puzzled by this. He spent all summer poring over the data, and finally he went to the observers and said, okay, tell me, what tipped you off? Because I didn't tell you their data. And here's what the observers said. You know, when you go into high-performing schools, what you find is you walk into a classroom, the teachers are organized, the kids are on task. You go to the next classroom, same thing. And you go to the next classroom, same thing. Teachers are organized, kids are on task. You go to a low-performing school, and you can find some of those teachers. However, you go to the very next classroom, and you see chaos or kids off task, things are in disarray. It's inconsistency is what tipped them off. The consistency said these are high-performing schools. It was the inconsistency that made them realize it's what we call the Forrest Gump principle of school performance, that classrooms in low-performing schools are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And what this means is that for school leadership teams, and for school teams, frankly, their number one job is to reduce that variability, to raise the quality and the consistency inside the school environment so that you can guarantee any parent, doesn't matter what classroom your child is in this year, he or she is going to get a great experience, and they will learn what they need to learn. That's one of the key things that we see in high reliability systems, going back to the whole idea of we need routines. Maybe that's having a clear instructional model to say this is how we teach, so we all get good at it together. You wouldn't want your surgeons in an operating room saying, hand me the sharp, pointy thing, right? We need a common vocabulary saying, hand me the scalpel. So we need that same kind of consistency. There's another piece, though. So these don't have to be kind of Big Brother, George Orwellian in 1984 environments, kind of a drudgery. But it really is. And the other piece is this notion of a strong school culture. McREL did a similar study of high-performing, high-need schools and low-performing high-need schools. And here's what we found when we surveyed hundreds of teachers. What the biggest difference in the high-performing schools was there was a strong sense of school culture, a press for achievement, teacher influence in school decisions, clarity about expectations for learning and for behavior, the academics and, like I said, an academic press for achievement was front and center. So a school culture is really important, and so we call it the secret sauce of school improvement. What we mean by that is, you can take even the best intervention and bring it to, that's been working over at school A, bring it to school B. If there's not a strong school culture there, that culture is going to eat that better strategy for breakfast every day. So it's creating a strong school culture that's so vitally important. So ponder for a moment, where do you see your school environment? Are you a big unhappy family, dysfunctional, full of mistrust? Or maybe you're a happy family, but no one's pushing anyone to achieve at higher levels or to help students succeed more. So sometimes one of the first phases is to say we're going to have consistency here, we're going to have routines, and we'll apply those. Maybe we only do them really through close monitoring. So you want to get to what my friend and colleague David Hopkins has coined, precision without prescription, where we are working together through peer coaching and collaboration to get one another better at what we're doing together, right, collaboratively. And when we get there, then it's much easier to move to this next phase where we're starting to anticipate and solve problems together and maybe using action research to test new ideas and see if they work. And when we start to find things that work, say, now those should go back into our routines and our consistency of what we're going to do every day. So Roger will, after this webinar is done, will provide you with a way to access this graphic, but maybe just a quick snapshot to see where are you and what are the things that really you ought to be focusing on right now. If anything's in that kind of orange column where, geez, we've got a lot of inconsistency here, that's a good opportunity. Maybe that's the one or two things you need to focus on. Certainly if kids are feeling unsafe, obviously that's where you're going to start. There may be some things where you say we need to create those routines and put those in place first before we leap ahead to doing something, cool or exciting like one-to-one initiatives, right? Or personalization. Because personalization, when you think about it, really it's a combination of great teaching strategies and clarity about what a curriculum needs to be and how we need to prepare every kid for success at the next stage in their learning journey. So I'm hoping that what we've done is giving you a chance to think about where are you on your journey to success. And it's always a journey, right? It's a continuous journey to innovation and to improvement. And hopefully every day we're getting better at what we're doing. So my hope is that what we've done here in the last half an hour or so, I know it's been a quick run through a lot of stuff. We've kind of water skied over some things that we could easily scuba dive into deeply, and we'll have actually follow-up webinars later on where we have a chance to go deeper on some of these ideas. But I'm hoping what we've done is maybe cut through some of the fog. So, I wish I could say I could wave a magic wand and make all those mandates go away, the things that you're dealing with. But hopefully what we've done is help you maybe see those mandates through a different lens and make sense of them and saying, oh, I can see how some of those things really would help us put new routines in place before we move on to something else that may be more innovative. Maybe it can also help you do this. Sometimes we have self-inflicted wounds. We put too much on ourselves. Maybe it's a chance to see what are those things that I want to do someday, but just not today. Maybe it's also helped you give you something you can go to your supervisors with and say, I want to do those things, but first I've got to lay a foundation here. So in the end, what I'm hoping we've done is provide perhaps just a bit of a light in the fog, giving you maybe one or two things to focus on now and greater clarity about where you can go in the future. So in conclusion, I want to wish all of you every success in the remainder of the school year. And because I know that, the people that we know matter most, right, our students are all depending on us to help them flourish. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. And at this time, we do have some time still available, a few minutes to take some questions if anybody in our audience does want to pose a question to Brian. And I'll start off by Brian asking if you have suggestions for superintendents or other district leaders who might be looking for tools and resources to help them really dive into that What Matters Most pathway and gauge where their district might be performing in those 5 areas, and if you have any suggestions on tools and resources for that.
Sure, yes, and as I mentioned, we have a report called Changing the Odds. It's a free report. You can download it from the McREL website. There's a book called Simply Better that really goes through that What Matters Most framework. We also have a free report on high reliability organizations that might help you think about what that progression looks like in your system. And we also will be developing, we've had a survey for a while on what matters most. We're going to be doing an R&D effort to help really clarify those pathways. So if any of you are interested in participating in an R&D effort, Roger will give you a way to contact us, and we'll follow up with an opportunity. It'll be a free survey, and you'll help us get smarter too at identifying those pathways forward. So there's lots of free resources on the McREL website. We also offer free half-an-hour consultations that might help you see, where do I need to go from here. So no strings attached to that. It's just simply something we do to help people find their best opportunities for improvement.
Okay, and for everyone who's joining us today, I've put Brian's contact information up on the screen. I know that he'd be happy to chat with you further if you have a question you'd like to send him through email or by phone call, as he mentioned. Looking at the chat, doesn't look like we have any other additional questions for everybody, so I think we'll draw today's session to a close. Thank you for joining us. I will be following up with each of you, sending you an email with additional resources and a link to the recording of today's session and a PDF of the slides that Brian presented. Again, thank you for joining us today, and this will conclude our webinar.
Thanks, everybody. I look forward to hearing from you.